What if everything you know about Christianity is a lie? What if the faith you've practiced, the sermons you've heard, and the history you've learned have all been carefully crafted deceptions designed to hide the most explosive truth in religious history? In the next 20 minutes, you'll discover evidence so shocking that it will forever shatter your understanding of how Christianity really began. But be warned, once you see this proof, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. Deep beneath the bustling streets of Rome, past the tourist crowds and souvenir shops, lies a network of ancient catacombs that tourists never see. These forgotten tunnels hold secrets that powerful religious institutions have spent 17 centuries trying to bury. On a cold November morning in 2019, a team of archaeologists made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the Vatican's highest offices and caused Protestant seminary professors to frantically rewrite their curriculum. They found a sealed chamber containing artifacts that prove early Christians weren't just practicing Catholic rituals, they were Catholic. The discovery happened purely by accident. Dr. Maria Castellano, a respected archaeologist from the University of Rome, was conducting routine maintenance on a section of catacombs when her ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly. Behind a seemingly solid wall of ancient stone, her equipment revealed a hidden space that had been deliberately sealed off from the world for over 1,000 years. The Vatican's response was immediate and telling. They dispatched a team of their most secretive archivists within hours of the discovery, armed with non-disclosure agreements that would make government intelligence agencies jealous. But what they found inside that chamber was already too explosive to contain. The walls were covered with frescoes dating to the 1st century after Christ's death, showing Christians engaged in unmistakably Catholic practices. There were depictions of priests celebrating what could only be described as the Mass, complete with consecrated bread and wine. There were images of early Christians praying to Mary, venerating relics of martyrs, and showing reverence to a figure clearly identified as the Bishop of Rome, what we would today call the Pope. This wasn't some later development of Christianity. These were the original Christians, the ones who walked with the apostles. The implications hit like a theological earthquake. For 500 years, Protestant denominations have built their entire identity on the claim that Catholicism was a corruption of original Christianity, that the Catholic Church was invented by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 313 AD to control the masses. Seminary students are taught that early Christians practiced a pure, simple faith that bore no resemblance to Catholic ritual and hierarchy. Millions of believers have been told their entire lives that Catholic practices like the Mass, papal authority, and veneration of saints were pagan additions that polluted the pure gospel message. Yet here was physical, undeniable proof that the earliest Christians, the ones closest to Jesus himself, were practicing what any modern observer would immediately recognize as Catholicism. The artifacts in that hidden chamber told a story that contradicted everything mainstream Christianity had taught for centuries. These weren't just religious objects. They were historical bombshells that could reshape our understanding of faith itself. The question wasn't just what these artifacts proved, it was why someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide them from the world. Dr. Castellano's team documented everything before Vatican officials could intervene, but their initial reports were quickly classified and removed from academic databases. The few photographs that escaped official censorship show Christian symbols that most Protestants would consider Catholic inventions from much later periods. There are images of the Eucharist being celebrated with the same solemnity and ritual that characterizes Catholic Mass today. There are depictions of Christian leaders wearing vestments identical to those worn by Catholic priests. Most shocking of all, there are clear references to the supremacy of the Roman bishop over other Christian communities. The cover-up began immediately. Dr. Castellano was reassigned to a different project, and her research team was disbanded. The chamber was resealed and access to that section of the catacombs was permanently restricted. Official Vatican statements dismissed the discovery as routine archaeological finds of minimal historical significance. But insiders tell a different story. According to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, emergency meetings were held at the highest levels of multiple denominations. The evidence was so clear and so threatening to established religious authority that leaders across denominational lines agreed it needed to be suppressed. But suppression becomes impossible in the digital age. Word of the discovery spread through academic networks and religious communities despite official attempts at silence. Copies of photographs and research documents began circulating among scholars who recognized their significance. Independent researchers started connecting the dots between this discovery and other suppressed evidence that had been accumulating for decades. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate historical revision that went far beyond a single archaeological find. The truth is that this Roman catacomb discovery wasn't unique. It was simply the most dramatic example of evidence that historians and theologians have been quietly uncovering for years. In monastery libraries across Europe, scholars have found manuscripts that clearly describe Catholic practices among the earliest Christian communities. In archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean, researchers have uncovered artifacts that show continuous Catholic traditions stretching back to Christianity's very origins. The evidence has been there all along, scattered across academic journals and specialist publications where most people would never see it. What makes this discovery so dangerous to established religious institutions isn't just what it proves about early Christianity. It's what it reveals about the systematic deception that has shaped modern Christian understanding. For centuries, entire denominations have built their identity on rejecting Catholic practices as unbiblical innovations. Millions of Christians have been taught that their faith is more authentic because it rejects Catholic additions to pure Christianity. But if those Catholic practices were actually part of Christianity from the very beginning, then the foundation of Protestant theology crumbles. The implications extend far beyond theological debates in ivory towers. This discovery threatens the authority structure of countless churches, the validity of seminary education, and the faith foundations of millions of believers. If early Christians were actually Catholic, then what does that say about the Reformation? What does it mean for the thousands of denominations that split from Catholicism claiming to restore original Christianity? The answers to these questions are so threatening to established religious power that extraordinary measures have been taken to prevent them from becoming widely known. But the evidence refuses to stay buried. As more researchers gain access to suppressed documents and archaeological findings, a clearer picture emerges of what early Christianity actually looked like. The portrait that develops bears an unmistakable resemblance to modern Catholicism, complete with hierarchical structure, sacramental worship, and devotional practices that Protestant denominations have spent centuries condemning as unbiblical. This isn't a matter of interpretation or theological speculation, it's documented historical fact that challenges everything most Christians think they know about their faith's origins. The Roman catacomb discovery represents just the tip of an iceberg that religious authorities desperately hope will remain submerged. But as we'll see, the evidence supporting Catholic claims about Christian origins is so overwhelming and so well documented that it can no longer be ignored. The question isn't whether this evidence exists, it's whether modern Christians are ready to confront the implications of what their ancestors actually believed and practiced. The journey into this forbidden history begins with ancient documents that prove early Christians weren't just similar to Catholics. They were Catholics in every meaningful sense of the word. The evidence they tried to bury is about to surface, and what you'll discover will expose the most systematic cover-up in religious history. For over 500 years, a coordinated campaign has been waged to destroy, distort, and hide proof that early Christians were Catholic. This wasn't accidental ignorance or scholarly oversight. It was deliberate deception orchestrated by religious and political leaders who understood that the truth would destroy their power structures. The conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of major denominations, involves deliberate mistranslation of historical documents, and continues to this day in seminaries and publishing houses around the world. The systematic destruction began during the Protestant Reformation when reformers realized that ancient Christian documents contradicted their claims about Catholic corruption. Martin Luther himself ordered the burning of manuscripts that described early Catholic practices, declaring them papist forgeries, despite clear evidence of their authenticity. But Luther's destruction was just the beginning. Across Protestant territories, reformers launched coordinated campaigns to eliminate any historical evidence that supported Catholic claims about apostolic succession, sacramental worship, and papal authority. Libraries were purged, monasteries were ransacked, and centuries of Christian historical documentation went up in flames. John Calvin took the destruction even further, establishing teams of scholars whose sole purpose was to identify and eliminate manuscripts that contradicted Protestant theology. Calvin understood that Reformed churches could only claim legitimacy if they could prove that Catholic practices were later corruptions of pure Christianity. Any document that showed Catholic practices in the earliest Christian communities represented an existential threat to Protestant claims. Calvin's scholars worked methodically through European libraries, removing or destroying any manuscript that showed continuity between early Christianity and Catholic practice. The English Reformation brought new levels of systematic suppression when Henry VIII and his successors dissolved monasteries that had preserved Christian manuscripts for over 1,000 years. But this wasn't just about seizing property, it was about controlling history. Thomas Cranmer personally supervised the burning of monastery libraries, ensuring that manuscripts showing early Catholic practices were destroyed. Royal commissioners were given specific instructions to eliminate any historical evidence that supported papal authority or Catholic sacramental theology. Thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts were reduced to ash in coordinated bonfires across England. But the most insidious aspect of the conspiracy was the systematic mistranslation of documents that couldn't be destroyed. Protestant scholars developed sophisticated techniques for rendering ancient Christian texts in ways that obscured their Catholic implications. Key Greek and Latin terms were translated using modern Protestant theological assumptions rather than their original meanings. Words that clearly described Catholic practices like the Mass, confession, and papal authority were rendered in generic terms that could support Protestant interpretations. The mistranslations were so subtle that only experts in ancient languages could detect the deception. The conspiracy reached new levels of sophistication in the 19th century when Protestant universities began producing critical editions of early Christian texts. These scholarly publications claimed to present ancient documents in their original form, but comparison with surviving manuscripts reveals systematic alterations designed to support Protestant historical claims. Passages that clearly described Catholic practices were relegated to footnotes, dismissed as later interpolations, or simply omitted entirely. The few scholars who protested these manipulations found their careers destroyed and their research discredited. Modern Protestant seminaries perpetuate the conspiracy through carefully controlled curricula that expose students to only selected portions of early Christian literature. Seminary professors are required to present early Christianity through a Protestant interpretive lens that explains away obvious Catholic practices as either corruptions or misunderstandings. Students who ask uncomfortable questions about early Christian documents are steered away from problematic texts and encouraged to focus on approved interpretations. The result is generations of Protestant pastors who have never encountered the full evidence of early Catholic Christianity. The suppression extends beyond academic institutions into publishing houses and translation committees that control how ancient Christian texts reach modern audiences. Major Protestant publishers have agreements to exclude or minimize translations of early Christian documents that support Catholic claims. Translation committees systematically render problematic passages in ways that support Protestant theology, even when such translations contradict established principles of ancient language interpretation. The same documents that clearly describe Catholic practices in scholarly editions are presented to general audiences in forms that support Protestant historical claims. Vatican officials have played their own role in the conspiracy, though for different reasons. Rather than destroying evidence of early Catholic practices, the Vatican has systematically classified and restricted access to documents that prove the antiquity of Catholic tradition. Vatican archives contain thousands of manuscripts that would decisively prove early Catholic Christianity, but these documents are kept locked away from scholars who might publicize their contents. The Vatican's motivation isn't to hide Catholicism's origins but to maintain control over how and when this evidence becomes public knowledge. The conspiracy involves active collusion between denominational leaders who recognize that full disclosure of early Christian evidence would revolutionize modern Christianity. Secret meetings between Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic officials have produced agreements to minimize public discussion of early Christian practices that contradict modern denominational distinctives. These leaders understand that widespread knowledge of early Catholic Christianity would force institutional changes that could destroy existing power structures and financial arrangements. Digital archives and Internet access have begun to break down the conspiracy's effectiveness, but powerful interests continue working to control the narrative. Search algorithms are manipulated to bury scholarly articles that discuss early Catholic practices. Wikipedia articles about early Christianity are carefully monitored and edited to remove references to problematic documents. Academic databases restrict access to research that contradicts established Protestant historical claims. Even in the digital age, systematic efforts continue to prevent ordinary Christians from encountering evidence that would revolutionize their understanding of church history. The financial stakes in maintaining the conspiracy are enormous. Protestant denominations have built massive institutional infrastructures based on their claims to represent authentic Christianity freed from Catholic corruption. Billions of dollars in property, salaries, and donations depend on maintaining the fiction that Catholic practices were later additions to pure Christianity. Seminary systems, publishing houses, and denominational bureaucracies would face existential crises if their historical claims were exposed as false. The economic motivation for suppressing evidence of early Catholic Christianity is as powerful as the theological motivation. The conspiracy has been so successful that most Christians, including many Catholic, have no idea how much evidence exists for the Catholic character of early Christianity. Protestant believers have been systematically misinformed about their own church history, told that their denominations represent a return to original Christianity when historical evidence proves the opposite. Even Catholics have been kept largely ignorant of just how much documentary proof exists for their church's apostolic origins. The result is a Christian world that has been deliberately separated from its own historical foundations. But the conspiracy is beginning to crumble under the weight of digital access and independent scholarship. Documents that were successfully suppressed for centuries are becoming available online. Translation software allows researchers to bypass deliberately mistranslated texts and access original manuscripts. International scholarly collaboration makes it impossible for any single institution to control access to historical evidence. The truth about early Catholic Christianity is emerging despite centuries of systematic suppression. The implications of exposing this conspiracy extend far beyond correcting historical misunderstandings. If Protestant denominations have been deliberately deceiving their members about church history, what does that say about their claims to spiritual authority? If seminary professors have been systematically trained to suppress evidence that contradicts their denominational distinctives, how can they claim to be objective teachers of Christian truth? The exposure of the suppression conspiracy raises fundamental questions about the integrity and honesty of religious institutions that have shaped millions of lives. Most shocking of all, recent archaeological discoveries have provided physical evidence that makes the conspiracy's cover story impossible to maintain. Unlike manuscripts that can be destroyed or mistranslated, archaeological artifacts provide undeniable proof that early Christians practiced what any modern observer would recognize as Catholicism. These discoveries have forced conspiracy participants to move beyond suppression and mistranslation toward more desperate measures to maintain their false narrative about early Christianity. The archaeological evidence we're about to examine represents the final nail in the coffin of Protestant historical claim.